Hi everyone, it's me, your TA, and today I'll be showing you exactly how I built this form in foam core. So here I've designed this shape to have, a rounded side, some wacky bent angles, a little slice with a mitered triangle, and then an internal cylinder. So yeah, we're also going to be going over some very bare basics as well shortly. But I've also left this not glued together. It'll be either taped or held in place with pins, just so if you guys need to refer to it, you can actually open it up, kind of study what I did. And yeah, that'll be a really nice resource for you. So let's head into some of the basics. Alrighty, so we're going to begin with some very basic things about foam core. It's super similar to cardboard in the sense that you have two layers of paper and then a medium in between. So in the case of foam core, you can see here, I'm peeling off one layer of the paper. Super easy to peel them off. The glue that holds the foam and the paper isn't that strong. But yeah, so that's kind of the structure of foam core. And this will be really important to understand later on. But yeah, and once again, super similar to cardboard. Cardboard has corrugations, and when you have those two panels of paper, you can't really bend it. Same thing with foam core, but if you remove one of them, at least for cardboard, you can actually bend it in either direction. Um, and so the interesting thing about cardboard is it actually comes with a grain already. Like here you can see I can only really bend it one way, whereas foam core, it does not have that grain. It's just a solid material. So you need to actually, cut it up yourself and create your own grain on foam core, which is also cool because you can have that go in any angle that you need. Um, Although I suppose with cardboard, you could actually cut it long ways and have that be your grain, but anyway, that's your cardboard demo. But yeah, so we're gonna start looking at some very basic types of joinery, and just things to know about working with foam core. And so the very first thing is we don't want to have foam exposed because it looks kind of messy and incomplete. And that's why we actually have all of our edges covered by paper. So whether that's with joining multiple pieces or just like arranging a single piece to have like no exposed corners. So yeah, that'll be a really big thing to focus on as there's only so much paper you have on the foam core you're working with, so you want to keep that in mind. But yeah, so the very first type of, and the most basic type of joinery is called a channel. And super simple. You just cut with your X-Acto um, a little slot. It's just two cuts that are the width of the foam board that you're working with. And yeah, after that, you pull out the paper, you peel that off, and then I like to use my mechanical pencil to kind of like force the foam inside, force it out. But yeah, you create this channel and fits super seamlessly, and you can already see there is a bit of structure there. If you want it to have this be load bearing or add some sort of weight, like let's say it's a shelf, for example, you might think about doing multiple channels or having extra tall channels by like gluing foam core on top of them. But yeah, so onto our next little trick here. This is simply a cut channel, but if you bend it carefully, you can actually cover up your foam and have a really nice, crisp, gentle kind of looking joint. Um, and yeah, it's super simple, super clean. Another thing that you can do with the channel, but just good to know. And the next type of joint, for those of you that are into woodworking at all, this is called a lap joint. It may be called a rabbet joint as well. In foam core, it's kind of not, I'm not super sure. But it is just simply, using the paper from one piece to cover up the exposed edge of another piece. Because we don't want to have a butt joint where you have any foam exposed. So this is a really nice way to cover up. And yeah, so again, with the woodworking joints, here we have a miter, which I'm sure you guys will be familiar with by now from working with cardboard and chipboard and other materials. But yeah, it's simply a 45-degree angled cut. And this is good because then you can create square angles and they look really, really neat. You won't have a piece of paper kind of like at the very corner. It'll look sharper, but at the same time, they're a little bit tricky to do correctly, and they will kind of show if you don't have a lot of like precision doing them. And I find the easiest way to attach these is just to lay a strip of tape out, put both of your sides right next to each other, put glue in there, and then fold it up like a book right to whatever angle you want. And that'll be a really nice way to ensure that the edges actually touch. And then the final type of joinery that I'll show you is, well, this is actually a type of edge. It's a rounded edge. So it's really similar to, it's kind of the same workflow as before. You'd cut out a channel, but instead of actually removing the foam, you would just crush it. And this can create a more rounded edge. And depending on the radius of your edge that you want, you could add like longer or shorter bits of foam. But yeah, so with that, let's begin and we'll get into the model making. Okie dokie. So just jumping right in. A quick thing to note about working with foam core, you want to have really crisp cuts, and the way you do that is actually quite similar to, cardboard and chipboard and all these other materials, but you have a really sharp X-Acto and you score a few times going deeper and deeper, but yeah, don't try to one-shot it because then it will kind of bunch up the foam. Your edge will look really bad. It will just be kind of like hard to work with. But it's just a really good practice because it also makes your measurements a lot, more precise. But yeah, so here I've just started working on, the top and the bottom. My aim was to actually hit that cylinder and just get it out of the way. And yeah, so I actually have never cut a circle into foam core or like a kind of concave circle. I've done like rounded corners, but that's a little different than cutting right in the middle of it. So good practice, just do a little test cut, a little practice before you actually do it on the real thing. And yeah, so here I've been writing on sticky notes a little bit, and you can kind of see my thought process. Like, it's not a perfect workflow. By no means is this a perfect model. I just really think that it's helpful to kind of understand, like the different things that go into it in terms of like I've made mistakes, but you can kind of learn from those. And yeah, so I even got confused when I was actually cutting out my cylinder shape because on my drawing I specified that the diameter would be 3 inches. But then when I was, the foam core actually has a thickness, so I didn't decide if I wanted my inside of the cylinder to be 3 inches or the outside of the cylinder. Um, but, I caught that on right when I got confused and I was able to address it. And, I cut out a perfectly 3 inch little circle, and then I left some allowance, another like half a centimeter or like whatever your thickness of the foam is, just so that can like rest in there. But yeah, so here I've moved on into actually scoring a piece of foam, and I wasn't sure how long this piece needed to be. I knew it would be 8 inches tall because that was the height of my cube. But I like to, I use a piece of test cardboard and I overshot it. So just working with extra material just to be safe. But yeah, so I scored it up, I cut it, and I flipped it over. And when I was actually starting to, like break apart the little sections that I had cut, I've looked at the backside to see like, oh, are there any parts that are not like bent properly? Like you can kind of see how the light hits it. But yeah, so here I'm just fitting my cylinder to my 3-inch, and I'm happy with the size. It worked out. So what I'm actually going to be doing is taking out the foam and the top layer of paper from either side of the cylinder, just like that. And you could actually glue those, but what I prefer to do is get a flat piece of foam core that is, the same amount of material I took off, because that flat piece of paper is actually going to hold the two edges of that cylinder flush, so they won't kind of point out into a teardrop shape. It's just something I like to do. There's other ways to achieve that, like, cylindrical, perfect form, but I find this to be quite simple. And yeah, so that's the cylinder done. And I've also referenced, my top right corner for the bottom and the top piece, like just so I know what corresponds, which will really help with like placement and other measurements. But yeah, so that was kind of the first bit, and it is sped up, but that was roughly 2.5 hours for me. And on to the second work session. So here I will be actually focusing on a curved wall, but then cutting in the curve and the place for that to sit in. Because I decided I want my edge paper to be on the side of the side walls, because that would be easier than trying to kind of bend and fold a lot of squares from that like bent wall part. But anyway, so long story short, I had to mark out the curve that I wanted. Didn't have a compass or even a string, so I just went old school with a piece of paper, cut out a template, and I liked it a lot because you can flip it either way, it'll be perfectly the same, and it worked out really well. And I ended up making another one just because I liked a sort of smoother curve. But yeah, and then from here, I actually started to cut out the curve, and I experimented with trying to cut it purely from the inside out, so like with my like rough side to my finished side. But then I explored with, right here I'm writing on the post-it, I explored with the other piece, actually cutting on the nice outside part first, cutting that paper, and then flipping it over and doing the bulk of the cutting from that end. And that actually worked out really well, because I knew that even if I was a little rough with like moving foam or like the paper, I didn't have to worry about getting a really crisp, clean line because I already did that. And yeah, just checking to make sure everything lines up. Good practice. Again, I don't want to run into problems later on, so I'd rather take a little more time and care just to make sure everything is working as I go. But yeah, so in a little bit, I'm going to be focused on actually, cutting down my curved wall to size. And I just made the curved wall the same exact way as I made the that panel for the cylinder. So again, I overshot it. I have excess material, so I can remove, and I don't have to worry about, not having enough paper. But yeah, so I got the size I was happy with. And then now I'm going to be doing kind of an extreme miter. So I completely removed the foam from the very edge of the cylinder, and that still was kind of chunky. So I made a miter on my bottom piece, and you can see kind of I'm a little in the way, but yeah, so I made a miter. That still wasn't enough, so then I went back even further, made a sharper kind of angle, and then I'll also do the same for my curved piece as well. So you can see that right here. I'm making a really extreme kind of miter, and I don't mind that the paper is a little bit unsupported just at the very edge, because that is like such a small part of it. Like I wouldn't make this whole curve unsupported, but it's pretty vital for getting that really smooth joint at the very end. And then I got really nervous because I was going to start tackling that really wacky curved corner. But yeah, so got to start somewhere. I did a test fit just to kind of see, with tape, is everything kind of lining up correctly? Is everything looking clean? Is there any exposed foam? And I was really, really happy with it. But I am glad I did that test cut just because I saw one of my pieces wasn't lining up to the other one so well. So I was like, okay, let's fix that, and then save myself a problem in the future. But yeah, so time to embark on the wacky curved corner. And here I'm doing that really simple lap or rabbet joint, just keeping the paper from one, and that's just going to let me easily connect it, like right there. And then I knew that I wanted, the kind of like point of my curve to be exactly 2 inches in from there. So instead of measuring, like where my T-square hit, which would be on that piece, like the foam, I had to make sure that I measured, with that lap joint in mind, because that is a little bit of paper. And so it does make a difference, and you kind of need to think about, like, yeah, you need to think about the measurements and that kind of spatial awareness and all of that. But you may have caught it on video. I actually did that channel, and then I crushed the foam inside using the edge of my X-Acto. I tested it out. It wasn't as extreme of a curve as I needed, so I just, carved 2 more channels, crushed the foam, made it a wider curve. Still, it wasn't as perfect as I needed, so then I decided to actually remove the foam from the very interior, just because obviously the paper is a lot more flexible than the foam, and I did need quite an extreme curve. And this actually, although it is unsupported, unsupported, just having that like plain paper, it would actually be fine, just because I knew that I would be cutting in channels into the bottom and the top piece, so it wouldn't just be like a weak structure. But yeah, so then onwards, doing a lot of kind of like test fits and dry runs, and checking to see if my curves are going well. And so it all was going well, thankfully. And here's another type of curve. I wanted a wide curve. I figured out where I needed it. And then you'll notice I start to cut a lot of mitered angles. And right now it still looks kind of chunky, but you'll see eventually I ended up with this really fine zigzag. And that's because if you're, you can make a curve going, I guess, concave, if you, like the cylinder or that concave wall, if you just cut the strips of foam core. But if you need to have a convex curve, then the foam core needs to bend into itself somehow. So there's ways around that, like you could, there you can see the little zigzag on the video. But you can create like little miters, or just like the crushed foam technique. So you do need to think about like what type of curve you're doing, and just consider the materiality of the foam, and figure out your way around that. And then here I have one final kind of like bent curve, and I'll show you another technique for achieving that. This one has a lot of very tiny little channels. These are probably half the width of the foam core, but I just made a few of them, and it was so tiny I couldn't even jam my mechanical pencil through them. I had to use my X-Acto, but just carving out these little tiny channels. And again, they're really similar to the mitered zigzag that I just did, in that when you fold the foam, or when you bend the foam, it'll just bend on itself, just like that. Like a little gear or little cogs. But yeah, so those are just some techniques. There are plenty more you could experiment with, but just nice to kind of show, a few things to get you guys started. And yeah, using my square, I used my square a ton. You didn't really see that super clearly throughout the rest of the video and the before, but yeah, super helpful, just because I do want to have precise angles, and I want everything to match up well. So just keep in mind which reference faces you're using. And yeah, so here I'm doing a little test fit. Finally, figuring out the right way to cut, because again, I'm such a scaredy cat when it comes to taking away material. But in the end, you're kind of inside of the object. It can be messy, it's fine. What really matters is the outside. So if you're ever unsure, you can actually remove the foam that you think you will, but then not actually cut all the way through. And you'll see I do that here just because I like giving myself the option of, perhaps I need more material depending on how I bend this. So it was just nice to not have it be as permanent of a decision there. But yeah, and actually it worked out really well because I have these little triangles. I didn't fully cut away the excess, and that helped me a lot because they kind of held the curve in place. It would be hard to tape that like properly to the bottom, but yeah, just a little tip there. If it can still help you, why fully remove it? But yeah, so I have that curve figured out. Super happy. I'm moving on to the, I think, final element, which is the kind of like triangle cut corner. And yeah, so I have those little offcuts still. They'll pop up in a second, but before we get there, um, I'm just going to replicate the like the bottom groove, that little channel, just replicate it to the top. So I'm just creating a mirror image, which I mentioned previously that I wrote. I kind of corresponded which sides of the top and bottom, like which corners match up, just because it will really help. Like I obviously don't want to carve this channel on the wrong corner because it will cause problems later on. But yeah, so here you see I actually put in some foam in the corner just while I trace it, and then I used paper. I didn't have tracing paper, so I used it as tracing paper. I just heavily drew it, folded it, erased it off, and it rubbed off on the other side, just the way you'd use tracing paper. But after I transferred that, here's a cool little trick. I saved the paper cut parts, and you'll see that if I flip them over, they fit perfectly into the other side. And not just the width of them, but the angles relative to the edge of the square. So that just told me that all my angles matched up, and I did a lot of work with I brought in a protractor, and just to really make sure everything was accurate, because it does make a really big difference. But yeah, so the reason I kind of jumped into doing that top piece and not finishing the triangle is because I realized, well, I kind of can't really test fit this triangle cut unless I have all three sides. So I apologize for jumping in throughout, but yeah, so here I have the kind of triangle, and it's super cool because you can see inside. And then these are the actual offcuts. I didn't throw them away, just because I had the idea of, instead of doing math, I would just save the offcuts, miter them out, and then put a square, like a right angle, a little, I think it's called a gusset, just in that corner. So I had a right angle, and then I just traced that shape out, and it would actually be pretty close. It wasn't a perfect match, but no worries because I will adjust. And here you can see it doesn't fit absolutely perfectly because of math reasons. But yeah, so here I'm just test fitting. I found that it was a little bit too long, so I just trimmed it up a tiny bit. One thing to note about foam is it's really hard to make super tiny adjustments to the cut. So just keep that in mind. Yeah. And then I just mitered that off, and I also took apart all three sides of the cube and mitered those as well. So it would fit perfectly. I was really happy with that. And then finishing touches, I cut off the little excess bits from the top and bottom that I didn't need. And yeah, finally assembling everything together. Feels really, really good. And a lot of work went into this, but it was, it's always worth it when you make something that you're really proud of. And I really hope this demo was helpful for you guys. Again, this will be available in the classrooms, and it won't be hot glued together. It'll just be either taped or pinned. So if you ever need to, you can take it apart and kind of analyze what I did more in depth. But yeah, thank you for your time, and I hope this really helped. 12 hours, wow. Well, bye everyone.